Welcome to CityWorks, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month, CityWorks explores the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. On today's episode, Captive Labor, the exploitation of incarcerated workers and the unethical practices around prison work. There are more than 1 million people in the U.S. in prison, and most of them work in the prisons as part of their sentences, often without basic workplace protections and under dangerous working conditions for little or no pay. You might think that the jobs at least help prisoners develop skills they can use to build careers after their release. But think again. According to a recent study by the ACLU, prison labor programs overwhelmingly fail to provide incarcerated workers with transferable skills. At the best of times, most prison work programs involve menial labor. In crises, prison laborers are often paid a pittance to risk their lives fighting fires and cleaning up after storms and floods. Meanwhile, vocational training programs for prison workers are declining nationwide. Our two guests today have dedicated their careers to dismantling this kind of modern-day slavery and the cycle of perpetual punishment. Calvin John Smiley is Associate Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and a scholar and writer on the U.S. prison industry. He's the co-editor of Prisoner Reentry in the 21st Century, Critical Perspectives of Returning Home, as well as the author of Purgatory Citizenship, Reentry, Race, and Abolition, and most recently, Defund, Conversations Towards Abolition. He's also the founder of Till Everything, a restorative justice program for system-impacted youth in New York City. Bianca Tylek is one of the nation's leading experts on the prison industry and the founder and executive director of Worth Rises, a national organization working to disrupt the prison industry and end the exploitation of incarcerated workers. She also leads the End the Exception campaign to end prison slavery. Calvin John Smiley, Bianca Tylek, welcome to CityWorks. It's great to have you with us. Calvin, let's start with you. There's going to be a lot of people that say, didn't we abolish slavery in the USA? Doesn't they remember something about what happened after the Civil War? How come we still have some?
Well, I think the bigger point to that is that we all kind of think about the 13th Amendment and the exception clause of saying that slavery is prohibited for the exception of those duly convicted of a crime. The argument, though, is that prison and labor go hand in hand from the inception of modern prisons. So when we think about the Auburn and Pennsylvania models that started in the late 18th and early 19th century, prisoners or people who were incarcerated were forced to do labor. And so the 13th Amendment actually just really reinforced what had already been going on rather than created something new. And so I think we have to really think about it as something that was even older than the 13th Amendment.
Fascinating. Bianca, I've seen you write about this too. People may be familiar with that convict lease system. Where does that play in this history?
Absolutely. Just like Calvin was just saying, convict leasing actually predated the 13th Amendment, Emancipation Proclamation, and all of that. A lot of folks who were at the time incarcerated and primarily white, since most people who were Black were still enslaved, were actually leased out through the practice of convict leasing. However, after 1865 and the 13th Amendment, the population in prison drastically changed from being 99% white to 99% Black, and the era of convict leasing moved into probably its most brutal stage, where the practice of convict leasing by states, leasing out to private corporations, started to generate a huge amount of revenue for those states. And for most of those corporations, private employers who were leasing people from the system, they no longer had the capital cost of actually feeding them and making sure that they were sustained. And so many, many, many more people died.
Who does this affect today? I mean, how many people are we talking about? What kind of jobs are they doing, Calvin?
Yeah, so we see that it disproportionately impacts people of color, low-income people who have lower rates of education, people with other forms of disabilities and accessibility, whether mental and or physical, because those are the people who are often targeted. Those are the people who often can't afford good legal counsel. And so those are the people who disproportionately end up in our prison systems. And so what we see is that the types of work that that they are forced to do in many cases is work that can be very arduous work, it can be very dangerous work, and they're not often given both the training and or the safety equipment to do this kind of labor. And then we also see the type of work that is done in prison that is kind of the social reproduction of the prison. So in some cases, we see prison labor that then gets exported. So, many people might know of Angola, which is Louisiana State Prison, where they actually have meat and other agricultural farming that some of that then goes out into the public market.
They call it the plantation.
Yeah, the plantation. And so
on a former plantation.
So we see that, but then there's also other types of jobs that really just socially reproduce the prison. So doing the prison laundry, making the food that other people who are incarcerated are going to eat, making the clothing, making actually the types of chairs and desks and hand sanitizer that we'll see right here in New York State government buildings or in CUNY, made by Corecraft, right? So people in prison here in New York are making these items.
And what about data centers and call centers? I've heard about that too, Bianca.
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually divide the prison labor scheme into really three distinct areas, right? It is those for corporations. It is the work for what are called correctional industries, which as Calvin was just referring to. These are industries that are actually government-run businesses, and they manufacture products for other government agencies, like desks for the Department of Education or hand sanitizer during COVID. And, that's kind of some of that emergency relief we also know happens inside. And then finally, the bulk of prison labor is actually used to keep prisons and jails running. But I think it's really important because I've been seeing these headlines referring to these jobs as chores, as if like to feed yourself. There is nothing that is a chore about feeding 2,000 people 3 times a day. It is not a chore to maintain the grounds of, miles and miles and miles of square feet of facilities, right? These things are not chores. They are actual jobs, and, are dangerous in many ways. But these other pieces, those correctional industries that we were just talking about, they don't just manufacture goods, they also provide services. And those services are the ones you were mentioning around data centers and things like that, that are actually, not regulated by any laws separately where manufacturing is.
Well, we're going to come back to what does this mean for the entire economy, because it's not just the individuals involved, obviously, that are affected here, but all workers. But before we leave the actual incarcerated workers themselves, when we're living at the end of hurricane season or in like max hurricane season as we're talking, as you see the news reports of another devastating hurricane or a wildfire or another climate emergency in some place, where does your head go, Calvin?
So the first thing I think about is how many people are going to be left behind. So as we're seeing right now in places like Florida, the governor and other officials are saying that people should evacuate. Though there is no state mandate to evacuate prisons. In fact, most times prisoners and people who are incarcerated are locked down and then have to fend for themselves. They're given maybe an allotment of food, allotment of water, which can certainly be destroyed, contaminated, and then have to kind of literally ride it out. We've seen in other cases, not just with hurricanes, but in places where it can get really hot, where people are dying of heat exhaustion, or right here in New York City. I remember maybe a decade ago, a man was found dead in his cell at Rikers Island because they had found that it was over 100 degrees in the cell that he was put in. And so we see that there is certainly devastating environmental issues that we are not addressing as a society, and how that is then once again exacerbated on some of the most marginalized populations.
And then, Bianca, if you manage to survive the actual crisis itself, it's incarcerated workers who are often out there fighting fires and doing cleanup after hurricanes?
Absolutely. Incarcerated workers are heroes. They are routinely and consistently called on for emergency relief in our country. And that is time and time again, no matter what the emergency is. In California and Arizona, they're doing firefighting to help with wildfires that are spreading and threatening people's homes, in hurricane relief, and in that area they are removing and cleaning the highways and making sure that the rest of us can kind of go on with our lives. During COVID, they were manufacturing the masks, the gowns, the hand sanitizer that was necessary for society and for hospitals. And it's not just in these like absolute emergency crises, but even in fiscal crises. In New York State, for example, when New York State was facing a revenue downfall a number of years ago, Governor Cuomo at the time suggested that we have everybody get new license plates in the state of New York, because incarcerated workers were manufacturing them for pennies on the dollar, but we would get revenue from those license plates. So over and over and over again, our society really relies on incarcerated workers to rescue us.
Now, corporate media have an unerring ability to find the bright light in some truly horrendous story. And I think I recall a story in possibly the New York Times about incarcerated workers fighting wildfires, out of control wildfires in the northwest of this country, and how this was equipping them with skills that they could use after the fact. You write a lot about returning citizens, people leaving prison and trying to find work. Is that just happy talk that people might get a skill as a firefighter?
Well, I mean, you certainly can gain skills in doing that work. The problem is oftentimes they're not trained, but even if they do gain skills over time, the kind of irony there was that for up until 2020, you were not allowed to become a firefighter in the state of California, right? So what we saw
if you were formerly incarcerated.
If you were formerly incarcerated. So we saw these people who were gaining this kind of social capital that they could be using as a transferable skill on their return, but then being barred from that sort of employment. And so it wasn't until literally social movements and putting pressure on Governor Newsom that he changed that law.
And more generally, do people gain skills they can use after re-entry or as they're re-entering, Bianca, from the work that they're doing while they're inside?
I think it wildly depends, right? Like there are some opportunities where I think it's in large part what you make of it, right? There are incarcerated people who will try to find purpose in their work, right? And I want to be clear. I think a lot of people, when we talk about ending prison slavery, think that we're saying, let's end prison labor, let's end work. No, of course, people who are incarcerated often want to work, but they don't want to be enslaved. Right. And so are they getting things out of these from the extent that they want to and they can, and that they make it for themselves? But these programs are not designed to really do that. I mean, you have people who are making license plate. There's not a single license plate in the country that's not made in prison. So how is that a transferable skill, right? So there's so many different components that are really what you make of them.
And have you said what people are paid? I mean, when you say slavery, sometimes people are paid, but sometimes not.
Sure. The average wage in prison across the United States is 14 cents an hour. In 7 states, people are paid nothing at all for all their labor. And so it doesn't really matter what it is, they're not paid. But 14 cents an hour is hardly a wage. And I think there was, formerly incarcerated man, Terrence Wynn, who testified in front of a Congress recently in Senate, and he said the difference between antebellum slavery and slavery today is 2 cents in the state of Louisiana.
And I'll just add real quickly, then that's also, on top of the 14 cents, some of that is also then garnished for either court fees, fines, restitution, child support. So, that's gross 14 cents. We're not even seeing after it's been taxed and then all of the other things that are taken away.
And do you have the right to refuse?
Typically not. Typically not. And as we see that if people refuse work, they might get hit with a ticket or some type sort of violation. They could be put into some other type of holding, whether it's solitary confinement or put into a unit that they don't want to be on. So, there's a lot of repercussions if you push back.
Bianca, is anything?
And if I can add, there's also, when we steal wages for people who are incarcerated, we're not just stealing them from the person who's incarcerated, right? But people who are incarcerated, the large majority before they went into prison were the financial breadwinners in their homes, right? And so what you are doing is you're actually stealing support from their children, from their families. And I'd go as far as to say that you're also stealing restitution from victims. Because there is no way that someone can pay restitution at 9 cents an hour.
While we're talking about thieving, we can, when we come back, talk a bit more about what this actually means for the workforce as a whole. Because if you have the option to have incarcerated slave labor do the work, that lowers the floor for every worker. So we'll pick that up when we come back. We'll take a short break. You're watching CityWorks. Welcome back to CityWorks. We've been talking about the exploitation of incarcerated workers and the movement to end the unjust practices around prison work. And we may have conjured up the image of male prisoners doing all this work, but it's men and women. Isn't that right, Bianca?
Absolutely. In fact, we were talking about those call centers. Many of those call centers are actually women, and that's, in large part because businesses and DMVs and others where you think that people want to hear women's voices. So there are tons of jobs that are done by women. Another great example is Hickman Farms out in Arizona, which actually during COVID took 300 women from the Arizona DOC and put them in their warehouse, which was not a dormitory, and made them work in their chicken farms where they had eggs and all this. And there was a really great piece that covered the harm and the sort of vile conditions, but also the injuries that were sustained there.
Calvin, coming back to you, I mentioned before the break that this obviously has implications for all workers. We talk about lowering the floor on wages, but a lot of people that watch this program and listen are busily involved trying to increase the minimum wage and have worker protections on the job. What's to stop an employer saying, well, to hell with that, I'm just going to work with prison labor? How do you get to be an employer who works with prison labor?
So there's a lot of incentives to work with prison labor, right? You can get different kind of federal bonds or other kind of state grants to kind of use that. And then we see sometimes companies pat themselves on the back because they say, look at us, we're giving these people jobs and things like that. Then going back to the things that we talked about, you don't have to pay them, you don't have to actually have the same kind of health, safety and all those types of things. I think the bigger thing when we think about labor and incarceration is there's a tension there sometimes when we think about unions, right? Unions, while they might want to be involved, they are also thinking about how do we then protect our union folks.
Workers.
Yeah, our union workers who are on the outside too, and we can bring people in. But I do think that there is a history to that, right? When we look at places like Walpole prison up in Massachusetts, they created a prison labor union in the 1970s that, really negotiated for better conditions in the prison. When we look at places like Attica, where they had a council that came together and said, we want, Black and Latino guards, we want better health care. And these are all things that we would now even say today are just kind of reforms, but at the time they're very radical asks. Right. So I think that what we need to continue to see is those kind of coalitions being built and seeing, okay, we might not have the exact same starting point, we all have to have the same end goal. And what is that end goal? It's about safety, it's about care, it's about making sure that everyone has livable wages, everyone can have things to get by in this very harsh world that we live in.
Are there initiatives like that taking place today, Bianca, especially reaching out to unions perhaps?
Absolutely. So, you mentioned earlier, we run the End the Exception campaign, which is a campaign that advocates for the passage of the Abolition Amendment, a constitutional amendment that would end the exception in the 13th Amendment by simply saying that slavery and involuntary servitude cannot be imposed as criminal punishment. We have a coalition of over 90 national organizations that really are a wide range of social justice issues. And in that, we are currently expanding our conversations around labor unions and getting labor unions involved in the campaign.
What do you think are the chances for real reform? You've been looking and talking to people for your most recent book, Calvin, who have been involved in the abolition movement. Another idea that to some seems like pie in the sky, but your book's all about unpacking that, looking at it more closely.
Yeah, and I think where we saw in the summer of 2020 with the kind of rise of the hashtag defund, defund really became a very pragmatic way to make abolition materialize, right? That we can not think of this as a pie in the sky thing, but we can start, right? Our entry point is thinking about it as a policy issue.
Defund the police.
Defund the police, defund prisons, defund surveillance technologies that are going to, surveil and target certain communities where other communities are not. And these are budget issues. So, when we think about New York City with the NYPD with an $11 billion annual budget, almost 40,000 cops strong. And then conversely, CUNY only gets about $4 billion. So if we really want to think, and we know that the research says education lowers crime, why are we not investing more in higher education, in housing, in healthcare, and maybe not into policing? Because if crime, what we see is that $11 billion and 40,000 police officers aren't stopping crime, then why are we still throwing money at that and not investing in other areas?
If I could just add in terms of like where we've also seen some of these things actually work, the abolition amendment that we have, which is a federal bill, is sort of a federal fight, but there are actually a number of state fights that are winning right now. Since just 2018, 7 states have passed state constitutional amendments to end the exception in their state constitution and really deal with what is in the 13th Amendment. And there are a wide range of states from Vermont to Alabama, Oregon to Tennessee. And there are 2 more states that will have such a ballot initiative on their ballot in November this year, California and Nevada. So there is actual real traction around this idea of can we end slavery in our prisons?
Another angle on this is how do we reduce recidivism? People who've been incarcerated getting incarcerated again for parole violations or for committing of another crime. You've looked at that too, Calvin. Well, both of you. Your phrase purgatory citizenship really haunts me. What are people up against when they come out?
Right, so what we see is that many people who come out are not really out. And I think oftentimes we've thought of reentry as kind of your termination of being incarcerated. And what I would argue is that reentry is only, or rather it's simply an extension of your perpetual punishment that we see, whether that is you go back for technical violations, some other form of ridiculous rule that you broke, right? In my book, I talk about one guy who was in a federal halfway house. The halfway house was a tobacco-free halfway house. And he showed back up with a cigarette in his front pocket, and they sent him back to federal prison, right? I mean, that's just, ridiculous. Or a young man who lost out on housing because his aunt, where he was living, had pit bulls, and his parole stipulated that he couldn't be around certain breeds of dogs. And so we see also the criminalization of non-humans in the way that we criminalize people. So again, the kind of ways in which the carceral system and carceral logics has tentacles in almost every facet of our life is something that Bianca and I and many others are trying to dismantle every single day.
And what about the workplace power that you might have? I'm thinking in terms of, well, an inventory taking perhaps of how many of the things you use in your daily life are actually made by incarcerated workers or slave workers. Are there things your workplace organization, whether it's a workers' center or a union, just a group of workers, could do to help somebody returning, help support them perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think first, if you're working for a big company, you can see if that company is invested in prison labor and really maybe get them to divest, right? So we've seen movements around divestment. We can think about other kind of matching programs that, if you donate to an organization, maybe your company could have a matching clause, and then see if your company has any stipulations around hiring formerly incarcerated. And if they do, maybe you can, challenge that and get that removed in some way. So, we've seen things like Ban the Box that was big in probably the early 2010s. I mean, it's still around, but I'm saying when it was really...
That's where you have to identify that you have
right,
incarcerated
right.
when you're applying for a job.
Yeah, and there's been movements again to remove that question from employment applications. So, we all have power. It's just how we tend to wield or utilize it.
Bianca, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a few of the things that you said, right? So for folks who are interested in exploring exactly what you just asked, which is like what companies are using prison labor, we actually have a database that you can go and access at data.worthrises.org, where you can actually see a list of corporations that we've been able to confirm are using prison labor. We also have a campaign against corporations that are using prison labor, where we are asking them to stop using prison labor, institute supply chain policies that prohibit the use of prison labor, and to endorse the abolition amendment so that we can get to a viable place where prison labor and incarcerated people can work in a safe and dignified way. And so you can visit endtheexception.com, and there you can both take action on the corporate campaign, but also reach out to your Congress member to ensure that they are co-sponsoring the abolition amendment. And of course, I think you can follow our work at worthrises.org, where we are consistently putting out new information, resources, and actions that you can take to help end this situation.
And this is a super naive sounding question, but if you are in a workplace lucky enough to have some returning citizens working there, is there a way you can help those people without being incredibly patronizing?
I would say treat them as humans. Treat them like you would treat anybody else, right? We have to understand that incarceration is not someone's whole identity. It's just part of their life. And one thing that we do know in the United States is that many people have had either direct or indirect contact with the criminal legal system. And so I think you can try to maybe understand their story a little bit more, maybe if they're willing to talk about it. But otherwise, they're just Fred or Sally. They're your coworker.
Maybe keep an eye out for them. Thank you both. It's been great having you with us. Thank you, Calvin John Smiley and Bianca Tylek. It's been wonderful talking with you. And that is it for this time on CityWorks. If you have comments or questions, you can write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. And be sure to download the new CUNY TV app, where you can watch this show and all of CUNY TV's programming. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for joining us.